Hey, Trev here from SpineWise, and today I want to talk to you about coffee and more particularly about caffeine and the positives and negatives associated with blood sugar handling with it. Like always guys, if you're loving our videos and love our content, please like, share our material. The more we can get out, the more people we can reach and the more people we can help as well. Alright, so let's talk about caffeine because there's some myths that go around about coffee and we want to start trying to understand the mechanisms of how coffee or caffeine can actually have an impact on your blood sugars, because there are some research to say that it will help diabetics and some research to say that it won't. So let me explain the mechanics of how it works, and I'll talk about little things that you can do to implement and to make sure that coffee is safe for you to have on a daily basis. Alright, so let's start with caffeine itself. So one thing we need to understand is caffeine is a stimulant, okay? It drives stimulation. The two big hormones it tends to affect, number one, the first one is a hormone called adrenaline, or also known as epinephrine, and the other is cortisol. And these have slightly different things. Yes, they're both stress hormones, but they're very different stress hormones. Let me explain. Adrenaline is a hormone that gets you up to the task. Cortisol is a stress hormone that keeps you alive. Okay, and there's subtle variations between the two, but they're both used in sync with each other in your flight or fight responses. So to give you an example, an athlete that's about to get up and race has a high amount of adrenaline to get themselves going. An athlete that is overtraining now has a higher level of cortisol. Okay, so it's a little bit of a subtle difference, but one is a survival mechanism, the other one is getting yourself up to task. Caffeine does tend to affect both of them. The big one really that affects though is adrenaline. And one of the things that happens when it affects adrenaline is adrenaline then stimulates insulin function. It elevates your insulin levels. So this is where the research gets a bit confusing, because if you're type 2 diabetic and you have caffeine, it may actually initially lower your blood sugars down because you're releasing more insulin. The problem with that though is when you're releasing insulin on a regular basis constantly, it tends to often lead to insulin resistance, which is what we're talking here, which is what basically type 2 diabetes is in a nutshell. So it potentially may actually create more problems for you long term. When we start looking at cortisol though, cortisol is our main stress hormone. It's about trying to keep you alive when you're about to get attacked. So again, it does lead to insulin resistance and it can make your cells more insulin resistant, but it also liberates glucose into your bloodstream. It does that by metabolizing fat, by breaking down protein, by activating the storage of glucose and releasing it. This in turn increases insulin production and release of insulin, which again can potentially lead to insulin resistance. So caffeine can potentially be a problem for some people. Now that doesn't mean caffeine's bad. Caffeine has a lot of good properties to it as well. We know caffeine helps improve liver function, for example. So it's all, just like everything else, it's all about how you use the caffeine. Just like anything else, too much of any good thing isn't great for you and can potentially lead to problems. The one thing we do need to understand, which is really critical though, is any time that you use a food as a drug, there is almost always a consequence for doing so. And what I mean by that is if you're using caffeine as a stimulant to wake yourself up in the morning, using it and swapping it rather than eating for a food replacement in the morning, which a lot of people do, this is going to lead to a problem. So whenever you use food as a drug, there is invariably a consequence for doing so. That's something to keep in mind when we do that. Alright, so what are the key things we can put into place to stop ourselves from really creating problems with it? Alright, so the first one that we found, and these are things that we've discovered with working with thousands of patients over years and years and years. The first thing is limit your caffeine intake to 1 per day, okay? Don't have any more than 1 a day. If you really need 1 more day, and I say need because that's generally what ends up happening, if you need to have 1 heavy caffeinated drink per day, generally speaking, you're going to be using it as a drug, not a drink, okay? So this is really important. Second thing is use it after 11 a.m. Okay, I know you're thinking straight away, oh my gosh, but that's the only time I want to have it is in the morning. If you're thinking that way, there's a good chance you're using caffeine as a drug, okay? Then that's a negative issue. You don't want to be doing that. So when we start talking about caffeine use, if we're using it in the morning, generally most people use it as a stimulant. So what we suggest is leave it till later in the day at lunch. Don't want to go too late because it may keep you up at night, but if we leave it a little bit later in the day, let the body have the chance to initiate food, blood sugar regulation, energy, metabolism, all these kind of things on its own first through its natural means without taking any form of artificial stimulant. And then if you want to have some still, then have some. And that'll stop you from falling into the trap of having caffeine as a drug. Other things to look at, move towards a high-fat, low-carb based diet. And you always want to get advice around this, but if we're going towards a high-fat, low-carb diet, that generally will help reduce insulin resistance. And if you're reducing insulin resistance down, then the caffeine potentially becomes less of a problem for you. Then there's some supplements you can use as well. There's a whole lot of different things that we can use to help regulate blood sugars. So magnesium, we know magnesium is a very powerful, very abundant mineral in the human body. And basically we use magnesium to help regulate blood sugars, but we also know that insulin is important in regulating magnesium utilization. So quite often we start having insulin resistance, magnesium becomes an important factor. EPA, I've discussed fish oil previously, which is what EPA is. And you have a look at our videos on EPA and on fish oil. It basically shuts down the inflammatory pathways that are aggravated or activated by insulin. Okay, so this is one of the big ones we want to look at. Not all of them, but it does shut down some of them and reduce it. Berberines. Berberines are a herbal component. They're amazing with blood sugars in terms of helping to reduce the effects of insulin resistance on the body. And even medicinal mushrooms such as chaga and cordyceps. Cordyceps is one we use a lot of. It's fantastic, modulated immune response as well. But chaga, there's not too much research on. They're mainly animal studies, but cordyceps is something which has been shown to regulate hormonal changes, stress changes, things like that. So it can also help improve function in terms of cortisol as well. So these are supplements that you can look at depending upon how healthy you are, what your issues are, other underlying health factors as well. There's a couple of key things though that we want to look at if we want to try and break the addiction. And I don't like the word addiction because it's the wrong terminology and it kind of has implications about that. Really what we're talking about is dependency. Most people who use caffeine in the morning are dependent upon it, not addicted to it. In other words, their system is somehow flat and they're using caffeine to normalize their system. In other words, it's making them more normal, so they actually need it in their diet, so to speak. But if we can get rid of it and normalize function without it, that's the ideal task. Then you can choose to control it, rather it controls you. A couple of key things we see with people like this. Number one, make sure you're eating breakfast to begin with. A lot of people who have caffeine first thing in the morning don't have breakfast, they don't get hungry. And the main reason they don't get hungry is because the caffeine, as we said before, liberates glucose into the bloodstream, stimulates insulin production, registers to the brain that you've eaten, and therefore you don't get hungry. Okay, so this is the first thing we want to make sure is that you're having breakfast, and we really want breakfast to be more of a high protein, high fat breakfast, not a concentrated carbohydrate breakfast such as heavy cereals and things like this. The main reason for that is we want that elongated effect on blood sugar control, and we want the fat to help regulate appetite as well. So a great way to start the day. Make sure we're having some protein and fat orientated breakfast. Things like eggs are fantastic for that purpose. And then the other thing we want to do is exercise in the morning. Okay, these two are really, really important. Exercise in the morning, and ideally, if you're one of those who can cope with it, exercise before breakfast. So what we've observed for many years now is that in people who exercise first, their natural choices around foods are much different, okay? So those who don't exercise tend to go for a more high carb orientated breakfast. Those who do exercise tend to go for a more fat protein orientated breakfast. And they also tend to go for less calorie dense breakfasts. That's stuff that we've observed here over many, many years of dealing with people who have major blood sugar issues. So getting out early in the morning, going for a walk, doing something similar, build it into your routine, and doing so can help actually when you get home, help your choices. It gets the brain going, gets rid of decisional fatigue, and in doing so helps get you on the right track to a great start and great choices for the day. Anyway guys, if you have any questions with any of that, or if you're struggling with caffeine and you want to know a little bit more about how we can help you regulate that, or even little tips that you can use to break that cycle, just post them up or send me a message. Always happy to help in any way, shape that we can. Otherwise, we shall catch you in the next vid. Bye for now.